So we have the situation that, and I've just described a few of the things that sort of all came together, and suddenly people said, you know, I don't really know what this bank has for assets, and I don't know how many of these things they've got in their inventories, and I don't know what they're worth, so I don't want to do business with them. And I'm not even sure that I know what I'm worth, because I've got a lot of these things that are very hard to value, a lot of these contracts that have been sold by the investment banks, and so forth. So that's when panic sets in. And if there ever was a panic, real panic, we're in it today. The system is truly frozen because nobody knows where all the losses are, who's really sound, and what do you do then? You sit on your money and you don't do anything. That's what's happening. Now, Senator McCain came up in the debates with one new thing. He's going to put a floor under housing prices. And then he didn't say how he was going to do it, but the next day he said he was going to do it by taking the money that's already appropriated and buying a lot of houses. Well, that's at least an action that gets at where a large part of the problem is, which is that these subprime mortgages, the people who had them can't pay on their mortgage. Now, just as a sideline to this, it's interesting to note that the people who had these subprime mortgages essentially made no down payments. They were paying less than rent because they had teaser rates, 3% for the first year, and then it goes up to 8 or 9. So when they're being foreclosed, they have no financial interest in the property. And the people who are getting hit are the rich who put their money in there. So I call it Karl Marx's revenge. This is unfortunately, that's just the start of it. Obviously, as the system suffers from a frozen financial situation, everybody is going to be in trouble. So what has been the response so far? Well, there have been two principal things done. One, the Federal Reserve has stepped in to try to replace the private sector and provide money so that people can borrow money. They've done it by lending money to institutions on security that is doubtful. They used to have government bonds or equivalent. And now they're lending money just like a bank. They're lending money for commercial paper. They're lending money to corporations. And unfortunately, when they do this, they're trying to liquefy the system. They're trying to keep the system going, and since the private sector is not doing it, they're stepping in place. But they're in a kind of a catch-22, because every time they step in and say, okay, we'll do commercial paper, two things happen. One, the people who were doing commercial paper said, good, I don't have to do it now because the Fed's doing it. And second, everybody else says, my God, if they're doing that, things must be awful. So every time the Fed announces one of these things, the markets go further down. Now the other thing is with the TARP, which is the new $700 billion facility which the administration recommended and has just been put into law. And the TARP started out as kind of a RTC, only with much worse problems than the RTC had. And what the TARP was supposed to do was go out and buy all these bad subprime loans out of the system, repackage them, renegotiate the mortgages, and then resell them back into the private sector. So if it works the way it's supposed to, eventually the federal government will own $700 billion worth of real estate, mainly home mortgages, which they will be trying to put in shape so they can resell them. And so I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week, and I said, well, they should be aware that our experience at the RTC was the longer the government held property, the more it went down in value, because the government is not a good landlord. It tends not to be in there trying to figure out ways to sell things and having teas to bring people in and keeping the place painted. And I think Secretary Paulson, who started out by saying he was going to have maybe 300 people handle the $700 billion of assets, has now begun to realize that this is a massive management job, because he's going to be the biggest landlord in history. And as I've often said, he may think he's just shuffling paper, but wait till he gets his first call because the plumbing's not working and they want him down there to fix it. They're going to be a landlord. So that TARP has just been funded. It's about to get started. But unlike the RTC, they don't own anything now. They have to go out and buy it in the private sector. And they have to buy it and then fix it, however they're going to fix it, and then resell it. Now to buy it, there has to be somebody willing to sell it to them. And they say, well, we're going to be buying these bad assets, so people will want to sell us their bad assets. Well, if you're a bank and you're going to sell a bad asset and take a big loss, you don't want to sell it, because that reduces your capital, and the next thing you know, the regulators say you either raise some more capital or we're going to take you over. So I was in Japan for 10 years trying to get them to get a similar thing going, a TARP which Japan had. And it never got off the ground because the sellers wouldn't sell, because the prices offered were too low. They were, quote, market prices. So I would predict two things about TARP. One, it's going to be a huge business. And when the government starts saying we're going to spend $700 billion new dollars, you can't imagine what comes out of the woodwork to help them. I mean, there are, and the opportunities to defraud or perhaps just mislead are going to be huge. I mean, at the RTC, they used to complain about the fact that I had an auditor looking at an auditor who was looking at the guy who was doing the transaction. But we never had a fraud. But it was very expensive, because if you're dealing out there with something new like this, there's no way to know pattern to look at what should be done. So it's going to be a very difficult and expensive job. And we don't know whether they can buy anything or not yet. My second prediction is they'll have to get started. So they're going to have to pay above market prices. They're going to have to pay prices that will be high enough so it won't put the bank out of business that they're buying it from. And if they pay high prices when they go to resell, their chances of making a profit are slim. Now, I know Warren Buffett said, oh, if I were running this, I could make a real profit out of this. And I agree, if he was running it, he could make a real profit. But he isn't running it. The government is running it. And that's a whole different ballgame.